I refuse to use the word intelligence. First of all, it's a bad word. That it implies there's one thing that we call intelligence, and we measure it on the intelligence score, and that's nonsense. We almost everybody has some special skill where they're really wonderful, brilliantly intelligent at that one thing, and they may be intelligent in other things under this, but we're missing that when we just give a single number. But it's a pattern recognition system. It doesn't have any understanding.
Yeah.
And there are some people who think, well, maybe that's how the brain works, and if you just have enough of it, it becomes intelligent and sentient. Recognize, no. We do not teach cooperation in the school system. And I blame the universities. The universities, we want to hire the best people in the field. Well, the easiest way to be the best person in the field is to be the only one.
Could AI be a team member in this co-creation?
Could AI be the gopher?
Yeah. Yeah, the gopher.
I think that's a good term. I think, AI is a gopher.
Welcome back to Invisible Machines. Rob, this is a big episode, really fun one. We have Don Norman in the studio with us. Don Norman, who I think maybe blew most people's minds initially with the design of everyday things. He has a new book that came out earlier this month. It's called Design for a Better World, Meaningful, Sustainable, Humanity-Centered. So he kind of introduces this concept that we had a lot of fun getting into it with him, like kind of shifting not totally away from human-centered design, but more towards humanity-centered design, where you're not always thinking about a product in terms of like the end user, but maybe that end user is humanity as a whole. Like, how does this product from genesis to termination, instead of just designed to roll out, affect the
and
world?
it's not just another Don Norman book. Each one of his books isn't in itself super interesting, but it's a culmination, of his thinking and experience and over his career, right? So it's kind of he's taking a broader look, and I think for anybody who logically understands that he's seen a lot, and the opportunity to synthesize that into a book, given he's been everywhere from Apple all the way to to now seeing GPT and chat, and being able to contextualize that for us all. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it, and I think this will be a super interesting conversation.
Yeah, it's cool too to have this resource at a time when technology is unlocking all these possibilities for the potential for systemic change, and a lot of these things that we've been talking about. So yeah, it was great talking to Don, and we can take you to that conversation right now, I suppose.
Good.
Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. This week, Rob actually gave a talk about AI and business to a group at Oxford University. So we spent a lot of the week in these conversations about systemic change and also about smarter machines. And our thinking was kind of centered around this idea that the term artificial intelligence is a bit flawed, or poses significant challenges, especially from a design perspective, because the word intelligence implies a level of sophistication that's really not quite there yet with this technology. And then also, when we think of something as intelligent, and especially when something can now converse with us through a chat window, at least quite easily, we tend to want to anthropomorphize it as quickly as possible. So I thought maybe we could start. I'd love to hear your thoughts on AI as a term and some of the challenges it poses as a term, and then also as a technology for designers to be engaging with now.
I was just on a podcast recently, which was about intelligence, and all of the participants. I was the first one asked to respond, and I said, I refuse to use the word intelligence. First of all, it's a bad word that it implies there's one thing that we call intelligence that we
Yes.
measure on the intelligence score, and that's nonsense. We
Hmm.
almost everybody has some special skill where they're really wonderful, brilliantly intelligent at that one thing, and they may be intelligent in other things under this, but we're missing that when we just give a single number. The second item is the word artificial intelligence came out of one of the early uh, conferences back in, I think it was the early 1950s. And John McCarthy invented the term. He was at MIT then, but he moved to Stanford. He was a logician. And I want to emphasize to people that AI has two words. And the first word in English is artificial. It's not real intelligence. It's not our intelligence. It's artificial. And actually, the band of researchers divided up into two halves, one of whom wanted to copy human intelligence. The other ones didn't care. They just wanted something that could do something powerfully, whether it did it like a person did or not.
Hmm.
Uh, and they use the airplane as the analogy. Airplanes don't work the way birds fly. Yeah, some of the aerodynamic principles are there, but it's very different mechanism. And on top of that, I'm just reading this book. It's a really good book. What was it? I can't remember the name. But it's about the history of neural networks. And I'm almost in the book because it was in the late 1980s when we had a grant from the Sloan Foundation to do cognitive science. And we brought in some postdoctoral fellows, including some crazy guy from England that wasn't successful in England, but the letters said he was brilliant. So we decided that's the kind of person we liked. And I remember we were teaching them. And so I gave a lecture one day on perceptrons, which was a one layer artificial neural network. And halfway through, Jeff Hinton, the postdoc, stood up and walked over and took the chalk out of my hands and said I was all wrong. And that what I was talking about was correct, yes, but that was old. And there's newer stuff coming down the pike, et cetera, et cetera. And my colleague, Dave Rummelhart, with whom I published many articles, and our offices were next door to one another, and we ran the laboratory together. Uh, he and Jeff hit it off, and they started building things, and pretty soon the perceptron had one layer of neurons, and they added a second and a third layer. And then Dave Rummelhart invented backpropagation, which was a way of setting the weights, and it took off. And it was interesting because it was still pretty weak. And years later, I met Jeff at Google, and I said, "Wow, you helped invent deep learning, and you've done all this other work." And he's now called the godfather of neural networks. And what was the theoretical breakthrough? And he said, nothing. The theoretical breakthrough is that our computers today are about 1 million times more powerful than they were in those days.
Right.
And yeah, but it's a pattern recognition system. It doesn't have any understanding.
Yeah.
And there are some people who think, well, maybe that's how the brain works, and if you just have enough of it, it becomes intelligent and sentient. And recognize, no.
I like that. I like that analogy you used. Like airplanes. What if we called them artificial birds? Would that have been better? Like,
Yeah.
like would that
I'm
have
taking, I have
steered
an
us all in the
AB.
wrong direction? I'm going to be taking an artificial bird to New York tomorrow.
But let me just finish this story. It only take another
Yeah,
sentence
please.
or two. I think there, I think, but this is basically it's widely accepted. It's not just me. Basically, that we have two kinds of. We have the subconscious and we have the conscious mind, if you will. And the subconscious mind is what the neural networks are. What they are doing is finding patterns. And a long time ago, a mathematician Poincaré said that he works on a problem and gives up, but his subconscious mind keeps going. And so one day, he's walking on a bus and suddenly, oops, he's interrupted because the subconscious mind just found a fit because it's pattern matching in what we call it a low energy state when everything fits and it matches and it makes sense. But he said, you know, the subconscious is very powerful this way, but it can't do arithmetic. And so it interrupts me, and I have to check to see whether this is really a decent idea. Most of the time, it isn't. But when it is, it's really powerful. And that's actually the distinction between conscious and subconscious, and that's what when Danny Kahneman wrote his book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, the thinking fast part is the subconscious, and the thinking slow is the reasonable one. And that's the conscious that looks at, you know, Freud talked about it. It's sort of a sensor that looks over and evaluates. And that's what's missing today. We don't have that. And so it's us who do it. And so if we use these AI, and I use them a lot, the chats of various types, but I use it like I have a good friend who's creative and wonderful, but untrustworthy, not in lying, but that his ideas are sometimes flawed.
Yeah.
So I listen to them, I get excited by them, but I have to check. And that's how I use them.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember who we were talking to, but we were talking about this idea that is the single concept of self is like more of a threading concept. Like the conscious mind is a single thread, but you've got all these threads that
Well,
are your
if you want to
subconscious.
say, if you want to take terms that we don't understand, uh, intelligence is one, consciousness is another,
Right.
and the self is yet another. So
Yeah.
you're lumping them all together.
Yeah. 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 This like single threaded concept of conscious mind, and then applying that to a machine that's multi-threaded by just its sheer fact that it's a system. Like you said, what is an artificial neural network? It's a lot of systems uh, that are working and sort of plugging holes. So so that kind of brings down to like what's left. Like you said, you have this friend that is like a bit of a muse for you to help you with your creativity that has good and bad ideas and you kind of build upon them. Um, which I would say that's like your creativity, uh, and then they're like word generation. So they act as a baseline, and then you create on top of that baseline. That kind of
Well, the
gets
other
down
thing
to
I use it for is the other thing is when I write, as you can tell by my answers to your questions, I go on for too long. And so I usually show it to
right.
my wife who cuts it way down. But I've now started putting it into these machines and say, summarize it or make it only 300 words or whatever. And my wife took a look at some of the work it had done and she said, I'm not needed anymore. Except, except, because I tried this on a friend's paper. He sent me this big paper, and I said, I'm not going to read it, summarize it. And I sent him back the summary, and I said, this is a good abstract. And he said, well, yeah, but it misses the most important point of the paper. And that is the point, because the system doesn't know what is important and not
Right.
important. But
Right.
second of all, I also said, look, that's a way of getting your abstract going. And then you can modify it. But I would worry if it missed the most important point. Maybe the paper is not
Right.
is not written properly.
Yeah, maybe you missed the most important point. Um, yeah, it's just a reflection, which kind of comes down to like, I know this is like one of those things we can't explain again. Like, what is creativity then? And and what is a- and more in the framing of like, what is creativity in the sense that um, what are we actually doing? And and is is this more of a competition between us and machines on who can be more creative, or is this a co-opetition? Where it's they're just going to help us, like in what you're explaining, um,
I
and
call it collaboration. Yes.
right, right. And could
Yeah.
this be a gateway to like being more collaborative with each other on our creativity? Like when I look at a lot of designers, um, and I know you in your book, um, you talk about this artist versus designer concept, which I find super helpful in really, I think, useful for lots of people to understand, because I think most people blur those lines, right? And they're super important, I think, to understand in the context of business what is, art and what is design. Because if you get them mixed up, it's,
And everybody does. And I keep
yeah,
trying to say design is designing for other people, and artists are designing mostly for themselves.
right.
Expressions. And they're both valuable, but they're very different.
Right, right. And so if you're somebody that holds the purse strings and you perceive someone's coming to say, "Hey, I want some money so I can make art," they're going to be like, "No. We don't have time for you to indulge yourself." But if they're coming to say, "I want money so I can design," oh, sure, right? Um, so if that person doesn't know the difference, and they can't make the distinction, then they don't know when to say yes and when to say no. And therefore, you have these projects that maybe don't get funded properly because the person with the purse strings is worried that they're just funding an indulging endeavor versus, like you said,
Well,
a customer oriented endeavor.
there are two different points I want to respond to in that. One is the notion of cooperation, and that we do not teach cooperation in the school system. And I blame the universities. The universities, we want to hire the best people in the field. Well, the best way, the easiest way to be the best person in the field is to be the only one. And so what happens is that we have specialists, and the more specialized you are, the better actually. You're deep and deep and deep, but narrow. And
Mhm.
yet, and so we're also grade people. We always say, how can we judge this person? And we have to write everything by ourselves. We have to take exams by ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. Yet you go out in the world, and almost everything is done in groups, and you have to collaborate, and you have to treat everybody else as equals. And more importantly, also, you might treat other designers as equal if you're a designer, but you wouldn't treat a business person, or you wouldn't treat the finance person. You have to, though, because every one of them has had. Well, you can't do anything in a business without having all these different people work together. They're very
Mhm.
highly related. And so I argue that we want to teach people how to cheat in schools. And we call it cheating because you've copied from somebody else. And since it's not allowed, you have to lie and make believe it's your own. And I'm saying, no, you should copy from somebody else and give them credit. Tell where you got the information from. I used chat for this, and I used my friend Mary for this, and I found this article, for this. And by giving credit, because what is creativity? Actually, I believe creativity is almost never is there any brilliant immediate breakthrough inside it that was never ever thought of. Almost everything that's creative is a novel combination of things that already have been studied and known about. And you can go any place you like. Look at Einstein's work, the theory of
Yeah,
relativity. It didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't that one day this had this freak. No, lots of people were struggling with the very same issues.
yeah,
And so,
yeah. Ideas built on ideas, built on ideas, incrementally. We talked with Seth Godin a little bit, and we were talking about co-creation, and we kind of brought up Saturday Night Live, like the writing teams that, it takes a whole team to write weekly and be funny, right? Because that's like, be funny by Friday. Um,
yeah.
and he brought up a really good point, which is, and even still, they write 1,000 jokes and only 100 are funny. Um, and we sort of, went like, the best thing that happened to Saturday Night Live was YouTube, because they would take an hour and then boil it down to the 7 minutes that was actually funny. and and so we actually, like, it's even with a writing team, even with co-creation at its best, you're still like failing a lot, right? Um, and I guess that's a part of a, a, a part of this concept that I think you're bringing up, which is like, you have these companies that are structured around productivity, like all come from assembly lines, and how to produce and how to measure production, and you go, well, what does it look like to have a system or a company that's that's managed for creativity and measuring their success, because that looks more like how many funny jokes did you get, not how many jokes did you write, and were they funny, right? And and I know that there are pockets of places where we see co-creation and creative teams that work really well together, that have multi-disciplines, that have different skill sets and variety that come to the table, and they work really well. Um, and I wonder, it made me wonder when I heard you talking about artistry, if that's part of the mix-up, is that we think designers should work alone, and because we're confusing artists and designers, and artists work alone because they work for themselves, but designers need to be teams and they need to work together, but companies need to create structures that don't look like factories and frameworks for these teams to work effectively and create, not produce. I don't know.
And you measure the team. Almost every team has somebody that there's a member of that team and nobody knows what that person does. But they all agree without that person, they wouldn't be effective. It's often called the gopher, gopher in the military terms. It's this guy who always, he's never in charge or whatever, but if they ever need a part, they ever need a new idea, he comes up with it.
It's like
You
radar
know,
and MASH for everyone who
exactly,
knows MASH.
exactly. And I've also the notion of productivity, trying to maximize productivity is actually minimizing it, because what you try to do is get the most work out of each person per minute, if you will, or per hour,
Right.
and it's a miserable way to work. And so what
Mm.
happens is people are not very happy with their job, and they can't relax, they can't be creative, they can't just take an hour off to get back some sensibility, and so eventually they quit. And when they quit, it costs you a lot of time and money to hire a new person and get them trained up and keep going. So if you look at the long term, if you have people who are happier and not pushed as hard and have more flexibility in what they do, in the long term, you'll get better creativity and less errors and less problems.
There's this other interesting element about Saturday Night Live, to bring it back to Saturday Night Live, because we should do that, I guess. But, everyone who grew up watching it tends to think that their era was the best, or that certain eras had the best cast members and produced the best work. But if you go back and watch full episodes from any of the eras, there's a lot of clunkers. A lot of the skits fall flat. And you always hear the writers talking about how, something will do really well in rehearsal, but then kind of die in front of the audience. And the YouTube thing connects to that in an interesting way, because I feel like it's like they're creating all these things for us, and then the audience is part of the collaborative process of deciding which things to immortalize. Like, which things do we want to keep sharing and talking about, and which ones are we forgiving you for not hitting the right notes on? Because it's not like people have stopped watching the show entirely, or there's this general gripe that it's not good, but they're still engaging with it that way. And maybe that's
The
part of the
notion
magic.
of the past, that in the old days, things were much better. I looked at that with movies. We used to make these great movies, and now, most of them are not, nothing. And I said, you're wrong. Because if you look back at the old days, what you're doing is you're looking at a 20-year period or something, and you have four favorite movies that are just wonderful. Well, 20 years, four favorite movies, that's about the same rate that we're doing it here. Saturday Night Live is the same thing, because when you look back and say it was really wonderful in the old days, you're picking out the three or four scenes you really remember from those old days.
Right.
And you forget that you had to wade through the whole show to find a little nugget in it.
Yeah. In terms of like co-creation too, academia right now is kind of reeling a bit from from ChatGPT, kind of instantly throwing into question like how people are going to generate work, how that work's going to be graded. Your new book talks a lot about some of the systemic changes that we kind of need to move towards. Is there an opportunity right now in academia to kind of hit a reset button in some ways and create more of these systems where we are teaching people to cooperate, we're teaching them more generalist skills
Yeah.
so that they can kind of move
I
around.
only wish that were true, except that the most conservative people on earth, as far as I can tell, are university professors, especially at the top universities.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And you don't make it unless you basically follow in the footsteps of everybody else. And everybody thinks that this is, I give my own lectures. Lectures are the worst way to learn. Until professors teach by lecture, because lectures are the easiest thing for for the professors to do, as opposed to working. And you work on these specialized things instead of working on projects, which are actually more important in the end. So, but look, when the calculators came out, remember the big fuss in grade schools about, oh my goodness, people won't learn arithmetic, et cetera, et cetera. And what they missed the point was because the calculator can do arithmetic so much better than I can. And today it isn't just arithmetic. It can do algebra, it can do trigonometry, it can do calculus, it can solve calculus equations. That I had trouble solving them. We all had trouble. In fact, we had handbooks. We tried to look up an equation that looked something like the one we were playing with to give us some hints about how to do it, integral equations. And what happened, though, is the fuss went away because it turns out that because I can use the calculator to do my calculations, whether it's algebra or calculus or arithmetic, I don't have to spend time doing that. And I don't make any errors doing that. But instead, I can think about the problem. I took a course when I was a student at MIT on rockets, and we were given homework assignments, and it would take us a week to solve the problem because we had to use slide rules and we didn't have calculators in those days. And we almost always got it wrong. And not because we didn't understand, we understood it perfectly. We were doing the right things, but a week's worth of calculations, you made errors along the way. And so today, that very same problem is a homework problem overnight. Because you plug it in the machine, you get an answer, which means, though, you can now think more deeply about what you're trying to solve and do much more intensive well, you can do creativity because all that grunt work is hidden.
Right. Frees you.
And that's where I think they're missing the point on chat. The fact that people are going to cheat using it, that's the fault of the professors by having stupid homework requirements or stupid grades. What we have to do is rethink how we do these things. And we want people to, I want people to think in their assignment, not just parrot back what we've been told. And
Yeah.
so chat, I think, sure, we should allow people to use it all the time. But you will still find out that people are very creative or powerful, and some are not. And we have to
Yeah.
teach people how to use it properly.
You
You mentioned the like that the university heads being some of the most conservative people. Like, is this seismic enough that it might compel them to start changing some of the ways that things
No,
are taught? Do you think, or do we have to wait and
I,
see?
I was told this by a mentor when I got after my first job was at Harvard, and one of the senior people took me under his wing, and he told me the way to succeed is to live longer than your competitors. and, and the point is that I think that's the younger professors who are going to be it's going to change things, which means it takes a generation or two to make the changes. And the worst problem is, though, and I was just talking to a professor just a couple of days ago. He's in one of the University of California systems, not San Diego where I am, but a different one. And he says, our business school does wonderful work. We bring together people from many different disciplines and we work on the problems as a team. And it's really powerful. And this is the way education ought to be. And I said, yes, that's wonderful. How did you manage that? And he said, well, actually, it's been a very long, hard struggle. And a lot of us don't get promoted because you're promoted, the university sends out around the world to the experts in the world to say, is this person worth promoting? Well, if I'm part of this team and it's doing all sorts of complex problems in many different disciplines, I may have published 5 important papers, but they were in 5 different journals in different fields. And so the expert only saw one of them, says, well, it was a good paper, but it was just one. And besides, it was written by 5 people. How do I know how much this person contributed? And so the promotion facilities, and in companies, the equivalent of promotion is a reward structure. The reward structure doesn't allow you to make changes rapidly. We have to change the reward structure. Again, so that the gopher, the person, nobody knows what they do, except we know that without them, we wouldn't succeed. That person often doesn't get recognized by the administration.
Yeah, you've said many times, I think, that uh, this idea of first principles thinking, or I think as you've put it, like find the root problem, right? Not
Yes,
don't address the symptoms, and I kind of go, well, root problem here is accountability, right? The concept that education needs accountability on the students, teachers need accountability to the students, the facility needs accountability by the teachers, and so they're trying to measure them all so that they can make sure that each person's doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they can hold each one accountable. And in doing so, there's no cooperation because the sheer concept of cooperation blurs the lines of accountability. Because the second you have a group of people that produce something, now you have to hold the whole group accountable, and well, that's not fair, right? So, so they got to
why?
separate people.
Why isn't it fair? Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
why isn't it fair? Exactly.
This is a person that's only published with other people. But so how do we know how much the person did? Well, published 10 papers and all of them are wonderful papers. It's probably not an accident that person was involved.
Yeah. Do you think the accountability is like top down or bottom up? Is it that students want to be held accountable because they want to shine and be singled out, and that teachers or professors want to be want to be held accountable so they can shine, or is it top down?
Well, I think that what you said is true, that the students and professors all want to be stand out, etc. But that's because of the top-down reward structure.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be that way. Look, when I taught this last class, it was wonderful. I was writing this. I always teach my books as I'm writing them in a class. And so, as I was writing the Design for a Better World, I taught actually two classes about it. The first class people loved so much, I was asked to do it a second continuation. And what I did, though, was I'd said the book has 6 parts. So I'm going to divide the class into 6 sections, 6 groups of people, and each of you is responsible for one of the sections. And when we come to that period of the time, you're going to present the material, but you should assume everybody else has read it. And what I'm going to do is to check when we start each section, I'm going to give an exam in class to make sure you've all read the book. And that kind of frightened them, especially the first exam. But when they had the exam, they discovered I used Google Forms. So they opened up the computer and there was a form, and they had 5 minutes, and there were 3 questions, and they only had to answer one of them. But the question required them to think. It didn't ask them to repeat back what they had read. It asked them about the implications of what they had read. And then after 5 minutes, I closed the form, but then I had all their responses in front of me. But I asked them for their responses in class, and we spent the entire hour and a half of that class discussing, and that was really exciting. And then the team responsible for the section continued for the rest of the week, or 2 weeks it was, to discussing it. And the students said it was the most enjoyable course they've ever had. And what they felt is that everybody were bonded and together. It was the first time they felt they were part of a team. And the way I graded those exams, I gave them a 0 or a 1. And the 1 simply meant I could tell that they had read the book. There weren't any right answers because I asked them these thought processes. But so I might have disagreed with their conclusions, but I could see from what they were saying that they had gotten the concepts, so they were wrestling with them, trying to understand how to put them together. And it was just it. In fact, what they did at the end is they said we want to create a website. So the second course was, well, they created a website about the book for people to learn even more and more. And that website is now running. The same website the students produced, and I actually thanked them in the website, and I thanked them in the acknowledgments. But it was what was different for me. It was the most exciting course I've taught, even though I've been teaching for 20 or 30 years. But the students said the same, and it was just, but it was so different than their normal courses too.
Should being a student be a competition? I mean, you hear things like it's not fair they use ChatGPT. Like, not fair. What's not fair about it? Well, this is a competition on who can get the best grade, and they cheated. Like, oh, is that what it's supposed to be? Is that like is that what school's supposed to be, a competition as well as a place to learn? Um, where does competition fit into this? And is it one of these human necessary components, or are, or are we just inserting this in here because that's just what capitalism's all about?
I don't know the answer, but let me just use science as an example. And actually, you think people don't understand designers, they don't understand science. Because people think design is making something look pretty. People think that science is all the answers. But
Right.
actually, scientists don't study anything for which we know the answers. Scientists only study things we don't know the answers
Right.
in. And so when you ask a scientist about something, they always say, well, we don't really know, or
Mm-hmm.
it all depends, or
Right.
John has been saying this and he's all wrong. Because one thing you're taught in science is that it's a competition of ideas,
Mm-hmm.
not of people.
Of ideas. Okay.
When I used to give talks at Oxford and Cambridge, they would rip me apart afterwards. And then we would go to the pub and drink all night
Uh,
because we were friends. But what I did one day when I gave a talk and nobody ripped it apart, I knew I had given a bad talk.
I I think that's profound, personally, what you just said, that it is a competition, but of ideas, not of people. Um, I Yeah, I had not thought about that, but that feels like a profound statement.
Well, yeah, and like one of the things that we talk about a fair amount in our book is ways that we can use technology now to take these tedious tasks out of our lives, but also about how we kind of need to realign our business structures away, move them away from an obsession with productivity and more towards creativity, which fits more in line with this idea where it's a competition for ideas. It's not who could produce the most,
Yeah.
widgets in an hour.
So actually, I had a problem answering Rob because I was also thinking that competition is good, but
Hmm.
it's if so look at two companies competing with each other on the same kinds of products. Um, And so each one is trying to be better than the other. And what that leads to is a general improvement of all the products
Right.
because you go back and forth. You know, I see what the competition is doing and I need to beat it. And they see what I'm doing and they need to be
Yeah.
better, etc. And the same with science. Science works that way. You have groups of scientists around the world competing with each other, but again, meeting in conferences to show off what they had done, but learning from the other people. Because quite often, um, this group reports these results, and wow, I didn't know that. Can I see your data? I want to look that over.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can't repeat it in my laboratory. Can I visit you and you show me what you're doing, etc. So it's a competition, but it's a collaboration simultaneously.
Right.
But I think the competition is kind of useful because it's good. It's a sort of a goal. It gives you some gauge of how well you're doing.
Yeah. It's
And it's more of
motivating.
like a friendly competition and not so much a cutthroat one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
it's
when I was at Apple, I was a vice president of was the research lab, the advanced technology group. So many we used to have a meeting. I forget whether it was monthly or quarterly of the vice presidents of research groups in Silicon Valley, and we had to be very careful. We couldn't talk about our businesses, but one of the things that happened is we talked about the fact that we were stealing scientists from the other labs, and it's maybe we shouldn't allow that, or we should be concerned about it, etc. But we ended up with a consensus is that that was a good thing. That
Mhm.
yes, you stole my best person, but I'm, but it spread the knowledge around, and it made all of the companies were better for that. And it spreads the knowledge around in an interesting way, because if I'm working at Apple and I get hired by Microsoft, my skills I use, but I'm not allowed to tell Microsoft what I was working on at Apple on the details.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but nonetheless, I learned how a different company operated, how it was organized, how it was structured differently, and the way they approached problems differently. And then if I come back to Apple, guess what? I'm far better now than I was than I would have been had I stayed the whole period.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's interesting with human-centered design, which is something that's been talked about for a long time. You know, you're oftentimes doing a lot of user testing. You're getting outside opinions. It's not like it's made in a vacuum, these products, but very often you're working on something that's designed to be commodified and sold and put against other products. But when you move to this idea of humanity-centered design that you share in your book, then those lines between individual organizations start to blur a bit, because it's less about what's good for one organization. It's kind of what you're talking about. It's like what's better for this whole ecosystem of organizations within an industry.
Yeah, we're destroying the world by making these wonderful, wonderful products that destroy the environment in mining and
Hmm.
destroy the air, land, sea, in manufacturing, and then in disposal.
But they made users happy.
But I still but I still say that human-centered design is, this is human-centered design is simply expanded, that
Hmm.
Right.
instead of thinking only about the individual people who use it, I wanted to think about the impact on the world. But the
Yeah.
principles are very, very similar.
Yeah, yeah, and there are all sorts of ways that design thinking can be extended, to the life or to the things that go into making a product, and then to the product's afterlife as well, to think through those steps.
And new business models, because we can't really rely on planned obsolescence. That's what leads to all the waste. So we
Yeah.
need a different model. But we used to have different models, and there are different models. Design thinking, by the way that designers work, I claim, is a way of thinking and approaching problems that can be used in any area.
Yeah,
Running a
absolutely.
business, writing a book, organizing a team.
So we have this interesting coffee shop that's in our headquarters in Kiev, and we don't typically have people from inside the organization on this podcast, but we did have these two wonderful women who kind of helped bring this coffee shop to life on the podcast. But there's an element of it that I think you might be interested in that they use the platform that we have for creating conversational automations and experiences collaboratively to literally just any job that they decide they hate. They have a meeting and they figure out how they can get this bot that's named Hugh to do it for them. And they've been actually able to kind of replace hierarchy within the coffee shop. They don't have a manager anymore. And they've kind of come to see that there are all these benefits to it, in that like people don't really mind if Hugh tells them or sends them a list of things that they need to make sure they do before they leave. But if a person tells them that, they're kind of at odds with that person. It pushes that person away, and it would make it harder to collaborate with that person. And so they've found that technology has kind of stripped away some of the hierarchy within. I mean, it's a coffee shop, but it's not hard to imagine that within some of these businesses, there might be ways to create automations where technology is kind of moving processes into the background or taking them out of human hands, so that people feel less at odds with one another and are in these positions where they can then collaborate more freely and kind of across departments. So what do you think about something like that?
I would love to see that come about. Yes.
Okay. All right, we'll let them know. because that seems like one of the
Yeah.
hardest things to solve, right? Is like, how do we get the people at the top, or how do we get these organizations that have been running on this model for a long time to shift and to do it? I mean, it also feels like the clock is ticking. We don't have a lot of time to kind of bring about this change. And so we're at an inflection point with this technology that is changing things very rapidly, and probably will continue to in unintended ways if it's not used very deliberately. And then you also have this urgent need to change a lot of things very quickly.
Yeah.
It's the old-fashioned view that basically that workers are not very competent. There has to be somebody who guides them and supervises them, and so we have this hierarchy where at the very top we have the most highly paid people that somehow are controlling and making it all work. No, I mean the modern views of organization are networks. not hierarchies. And every little node is a person, and they all contribute together. And you can't necessarily say which is the most important node or the most important person. And so maybe your coffee shop people, that they should maybe they should start a course teaching people how to do these things together, because it's not easy. It requires a special kind of skill and organizational principles.
Yeah, it does, and it's interesting because the woman who led the project was just about to get out of hospitality because she hated so many of the trivial things that made it hard to succeed. And so she kind of, it was like the last time she was going to try. And now she's seen that technology can alleviate a lot of those things, like move a lot of those pain points away and create opportunities for like these more
Yeah, but there
human
was an
experiences.
interesting comment you made, which is they together
Yeah.
would discuss what the parts of the job was that they
Hmm.
hated. And then they would together try to figure out a way to overcome that. And it
Hmm.
might be that they couldn't figure out a way with technology. But maybe there's another way that, yeah, we all hate this part, but so we'll take turns, or maybe
Right.
we'll do something else, you know.
Yeah, they were sort of um, training their boss collectively, and
Training the
and then
boss so he didn't need a boss.
yeah,
Yes.
yep, and deciding the things that they wanted the boss to remind them of, and the way that they wanted their boss to remind them, and and so when they were reminded, they knew that they signed up for that, and that this was just a machine. And as Anna kind of points out, they knew that it wasn't there wasn't meaning, deeper meaning behind the words. They didn't read into anything because it's just a machine. So it's not that they had a bad day, or it's not that you know they they told a joke that wasn't funny. They're like, no, we designed Hugh, and Hugh did this the way we all agreed, and now I'm just going to clean the coffee machine because I signed up for this. um, you you talk about this idea of generalists, um, designers becoming more generalists, having to look more broadly, look at accounting principles, and like really looking at the problem from a broader standpoint than just make something that's beautiful and people want to possess. Um, you know, and I was wondering when I was reading about that, if that's an opportunity for AI to co-create with designers to like bring that element in. Could You mentioned the spreadsheet? Could a designer use AI to craft the spreadsheet around the product that would help them communicate it better? You know, could AI be a team member in this co-creation? Uh,
Could
eh,
AI
eh,
be the gopher?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, the
Well,
gopher.
actually,
Yeah.
I think that's a good term. I think, yeah, AI is a gopher. That is, I have these. I know I have to put something together, and I know I'm good at doing this, but I'm not good at doing that, or I don't know where I'm going to even find the information. And so I send off the gophers. They help me. Um, I just gave a talk where I did that. I was trying to give good examples, and I couldn't think of any. And so I asked Chad. I said, "How much water is used in the state of California, and how much of water is wasted by evaporation?" And it told me. And then at one point I said, "Oh, well, that's really interesting. So, how much water does the average do households use
Hmm.
every year?" And it said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have access to that kind of information." And so I tried again, but eventually it told me, well, the average usage per person is 85 gallons a day. Oh, okay. Well, there's 365 days in a year. That means the average person uses 31,000 gallons of water a year. And you're saying that 43 million, these are the real figures, by the way,
Hmm.
43 millions of water are wasted by evaporation in the irrigation ditches, delivering the water to farms. And so I could then compute and say, oh, that's the amount of water it would take for 4 million people. just lost because of evaporation. And so I couldn't have how I could probably have found that by searching for various searches, but I just asked the question. Now it comes the answer, including this. I thought was really nice. Including it said, I don't know how to find out how many people, how much water is used by all the inhabitants in California. So I thought it was nice. It told me it didn't know.
Yeah.
It's an important piece of information for AI to share is to be
Yes.
aware of its limitations instead of
Mhm.
just willfully like hallucinating.
Yeah. I think that's one of the challenges I think we face in the space of AI as we try to create alignment. In other words, we want the system to not hallucinate, essentially to be less creative. That's that's ultimately what it spells out. When you look at this setting in ChatGPT and others, right? Any generative model, you have this setting called temperature, which is you could almost uh, switch out for creativity because it's the idea of like introducing more randomness to the result, and then that driving more randomness in the answer, and the more we let it kind of not just select the the top answer, and the more we let it kind of randomly select from 20 or 30 top words, and then build upon that, the more creative the answers are. So what we see is that we've released something, and the early releases were like far more random, like I guess what I'm saying is hallucinations equal creativity in the space of AI. And and so now a lot of the innovation is going to taking the creativity out of AI, not not putting it into
Well,
AI.
that's not completely true because don't forget they give you those controls. First of all, they usually give you the three levels, but if you actually go inside to the APIs to the programming language, you have a lot of other parameters you can adjust, and temperature can be adjusted, you know, from 0 to 100, lots of
Hmm.
permutations. The temperature model comes from actually because it comes from the physics, where if you're say melting metal, uh, depending upon what temperature you keep it at, the molecules form different arrangements. So it basically it's do you cool it slowly or do you cool it quickly by dumping it into water? Uh, and people who in the old days, people who made swords learned that you do both. For some things, you pounded it with a mallet while it was cooling, and that shaped the molecules. And others, you took the sword and you dumped it into water, and that did a different thing to the molecular structure. And so this is by analogy what we're doing here with the ideas. That's why it's called temperature. And but yeah, the fact that you can adjust it back and forth is kind of useful.
Hmm.
If I'm an artist, the artists who are trying to create new things, they want hallucination.
Yeah.
If you're a scientist looking for brand new ideas, you might want hallucination, but boy, you
Yeah.
better check. But if
Yeah.
you're trying to write your final paper, you better put it on,
Yeah.
no hallucinations, please.
Yeah, but now here we are, at least in my perception, and I would say the public at large is attacking these systems for hallucinating and for and for failing. Basically for failure. It's the whole like anytime the
Actually, the
AI fails,
public,
we attack the system and we say, "Oh my God, this is terrible," and we got to get rid of this. So it's almost like the same thing some people feel like failure is not acceptable uh, if that somehow doesn't align with someone's values, right? Um, so it feels
but
like
I think a lot of this is the journalists, because what journalists are the first people who get their hands on it and write about it, and their
right.
job is to make it fail. Their job is to show the weaknesses, and so they love to point out the stupid things it said, et cetera, et cetera. But it may take them hours and hours of trying to find it. And it's also, if you take a look at our new semi-automatic vehicles, every time there's a crash in a depth, it's widely promoted. The fact that 1 million people a year die in automobile crashes in the world, and 40,000 or so in the United States. That's ignored, but the one or two crashes from automated vehicles is highly touted. It's in fact, when something is very common, we don't talk about it. It's the rare event that we talk about.
Yeah, and I think we also maybe accept or expect machines to be perfect, right? Like we won't really trust self-driving cars until that's pushed almost to zero.
So that point is, suppose the self-driving cars were 90% better than we were. So that
Yeah.
it only 4,000 people a year die from automobile accidents in the United States, not
That's true.
40,000. Well, but every time it'll be a big, scandal.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as perfect. And,
No.
because unexpected things, my statement is, we have to design to handle unexpected things, but we know two things about unexpected things is first of all, they happen. And second of all, when they do happen, they're unexpected.
Well, and there are often opportunities too, like
Well, it depends what you're talking about. You're driving in
sure.
the
Not
car
not
and
not
something
not
goes
cars
bad.
crashing, no.
You have about a half second to figure out what's going on and what you should do about it. And I
Yeah.
point out in an airplane, when things go wrong and the plane starts diving towards Earth, commercial aviation, the first thing the pilots do is say, "Oh shit." The second thing is, "What happened? What's going on?" But they are very highly trained. They're trained on every single accident that has ever occurred because there aren't that many of them. And second of all, they're tested every 6 months again and over and over and over again. So they're way up in the sky. They have 4 or 5 minutes to respond. And so they invariably figure it out and pull it and save the airplane. And with automobiles, you have people who are not, they don't understand how it works. They were not very well trained, and they have a half a second, and that's not enough even to figure out what's happening.
Yeah. You talked about this concept in design, and I really wanted to hit you up before we ran out of time here on this, which is what I call like emergent complexity. This idea that engineers can engineer something, or designers can design something with a high confidence, or at least a perceived high confidence in the outcome or output of what that thing's going to do. And as we're seeing with transformers and machine learning, that we have more of an emergent complexity where they don't the algorithm, it's like fractals, like the algorithms replicate so many times that you can't predict the outcome. You have to, it's almost like a farmer, like, let's just put the seed in the ground and see what grows. And the example you used was, I think, air conditioners, where the emergent complexity was the collective impact of everyone buying an air conditioner and turning it on at the same time. And and how design is taught and engineering is taught. Um, how does it address this world of emergent complexity, or does it, or how could it?
Well, first of all, part of it is this understanding that it's a complex system and that the things that happen that seem to be relatively small are interconnected with other things that are happening. And so the air conditioner, as I pointed out, it removes the heat from your home and it puts it outside. It actually puts more heat outside than it removes because it's not completely efficient. And on top of that, it requires electricity to run, and where the electricity is generated is put more heat into the atmosphere. So, but it's still a relatively small amount, and there's a big atmosphere. But then again, there are 3 billion air conditioners in the world, and they've been running for 10, 20 years, and over 3 billion, over 10, 20 billion, 20 years, that's a lot. That's enough to change the temperature of the atmosphere. So the more you use your air conditioner, the more you're going to have to use it because you're raising the temperature. But it's not you alone, it's the fact that everyone is doing it. And that's a very hard concept for people to notice. But once you point it out, they do start to understand it. But then there are other concepts that are even more complex. And to say we're in global warming, well, how come it's been so cold for the last or we have a drought and it's it hasn't everything's dying and now we suddenly flooded with rain and rain and rain and rain and people are dying dying in the floods and they don't understand that and the scientists have not done a good job of explaining it and so but it's also very very difficult to explain. I mean, most people don't even understand how a simple thermostat works. You come into the home and it's really cold and because you've been away for a week, say, and you come back. What is the first thing you do when it's so cold? You turn the thermostat up all the way because that'll make it heat up faster. Well, it doesn't, but it feels so intuitive that you should make it. Say I want you to go to 100 degrees, and I'll turn it off before it gets there. But I want it to get there fast. So I don't know the answer, and a lot of emergent phenomena, by the way, are really difficult to predict.
Right.
I point out that the automobile was going to clean up the city streets because they were covered with horse manure. And it was really difficult to cross the streets. You ended up in filth. And in New York City, that was true. And the automobiles did clean up the manure and cleaned up the streets. But who would have thought that the exhaust from the automobile would end up polluting the world?
Right.
Because there weren't very many automobiles. Who would have thought that there were going to be billions and billions of automobiles?
Yeah, and those predictions just keep getting more challenging to make because I feel like we have more forces converging at a higher rate than
Right.
we did at the turn of the century.
At a higher rate, but if it happened immediately, you could predict it, you could understand it. But it can take a decade. It can take years, a long time, so much that you don't even notice the relationship.
Right. It
Well,
just feels
that's
like AI could potentially help us through simulations, like help us simulate uh, these things, and maybe we can see emergent complexity better with AI. So now you design something and put it in a model, and that model could run a simulation, and maybe you could notice the long-term
Well, yes,
impacts.
that's actually what does happen, but you don't need the word AI.
No, yeah,
Because
you're
we're doing models of all
singing my
sorts.
I got
song there.
yeah. We laid it out at the beginning and then forgot.
Yeah.
Well, that's how science works, actually. It's very good at making models and trying to predict. And they're getting better at models. The trouble with the models is a lot of them are mathematical. And the mathematics of differential equations is actually an averaging model. And it doesn't really tell you how individual particles, say, work. And so there's now something called agent-based modeling, where you actually you model a molecule and then you put several million of them together and see how they interact and what happens. And you can do that with modern computers. It's not AI, it's just that there's huge, powerful computers.
Well, and
And
could a shift towards like humanity-centered design start to engender just more of that thinking as a byproduct of people thinking more long-term in their creations and their uses
yeah,
of
there's always
resources?
been big economic models that are trying to do this too. And they were also suffering from a lack of data to know how to put the stuff in, but also computer systems that were not big enough to actually do the modeling. The big there's probably stuff I don't know about, but the system that I know of best that are doing a fantastic job of prediction and using massive computers is weather forecasting, and they use this agent-based approach a lot. And they've gotten really, really good. They can predict where I live that it's going to rain an hour from now, and lo and behold, it does.
That's a pretty big development because people have been bagging on weather reports for a long time. So
Yeah. But that weather is actually an emergent phenomenon, all of weather. It's
Right.
oh, that's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
climate is the underlying structure, and
Yeah.
that leads to these emergent phenomena that we call weather.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good
interesting.
point.
Yeah, and it kind of relates back to and yeah, we've had no problem as humans pointing out every time the weatherman's wrong.
Yeah, and every SNL skit that we hate.
Like we have
But
no problem pointing out when the umpire is wrong, and that's being replaced
yeah, good
Yeah.
point.
actually by AI.
Well, Well, this has been
But some
great.
people think it makes the game less interesting because empires are human and they make errors. Because some of those things, when you play back the movie in slow motion, you can see what the empire was wrong. But if you're an umpire trying to figure out where you should stand so you can see the position, and there's all sorts of things going on, and you have to watch, I would just watch the replay of the runner being called safe at first base, uh, and the person is catching up here, and the runner is diving down here and trying to see with the catch, and the runner hitting which came first. That's a really hard problem. But when you watch the movie slowed up, well, it's obvious the umpire made a mistake.
Right.
So it's actually more interesting, I think, to have a bit of noise in there because umpires are human. And when the AI could be perfect, well, that destroys the fun.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, technology has made televised sporting events run on a lot longer than they probably need to. There's a lot of time spent moving it forward and back and forward and back for everyone's
Oh, yeah. Well,
delight.
that could be reduced by better automation.
Yeah, I suppose it could.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Don, we really appreciate you joining us. It's been great talking with you.
Yeah.
And
Your book's great.
Yeah.
It's like a greatest hits. I think it's awesome.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation, too. So it was, I wasn't sure what topics we were going to cover.
We never
And
do.
I'm still not sure what topics we covered because it was a great rambling conversation that I think, though, touched upon a number of really important topics.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, we
Yeah,
like
we
to run
really
wild a
appreciate
bit.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is the kind of conversation I love. So.
Oh,
Awesome.
great.
Awesome.
All right, thanks again for joining us on Invisible Machines. That wonderful conversation with Don Norman actually brings us to the conclusion of season 1 of Invisible Machines, but we will be back in just a couple of weeks with season 2. We've got a whole brand new collection of conversations to share, starting with a conversation Rob and I had with Adam Chayer, who's one of the co-creators of Siri. He has all sorts of fantastic insight into conversational design and disruption patterns. Just a really fascinating conversation that we're excited to share with you in just a couple of weeks. So until then, thank you as always to the team at UX Magazine, especially our producer, Kate Timchenko, who helps so much with booking all these incredible guests. Thank you to the marketing team at OneReach AI. Executive producer on this podcast, Elias Parker, has also been instrumental in pulling together some amazing guests we have had on this season and that we're excited to share with you next season. And thank you, as always, to our video editor, Michael Litvinov, for making this podcast look and sound amazing. Season 1 has been a wonderful experience. I'd say it's exceeded all the expectations that I had. So really excited to move on to season 2, and we will see you again in just a couple of weeks right here on Invisible Machines. Oh, real quick, don't forget to subscribe to UX Magazine wherever you get your podcasts so that you can hear new episodes, especially the exciting ones we have on deck for season 2. Also, follow the Invisible Machines YouTube channel. You can watch new podcasts there as well. Thank you again, and we will see you soon.